A mass of Saxon warriors charges towards a group of unfortunate, isolated, but defiant Vikings stranded on the western side of Stamford Bridge. As the small, isolated group of Norse warriors hastily forms a shield wall, the Saxons close in swiftly. Saxons and Vikings clash, shield walls interlocked, roaring warriors collide. Iron clashes with iron, shields rattling under relentless blows. Finally, the Saxons emerge victorious, their foes cut down to the last man. Now only the bridge separates the main Saxon army from Harald Hardrada's Viking host, guarded by a lone, giant Viking warrior. In the 11th century, England underwent a period of significant upheaval and transformation. During this time, the Viking era reached its zenith, marked notably by Sweyn Forkbeard's establishment of the expansive North Sea Empire, briefly unifying the realms of England, Denmark and Norway under a single dominion for the first time. However, as history often demonstrates, conflicting interests and competing dynastic claims to the throne led to strife. A sequence of powerful but childless figures vied for control, setting the stage for what would become perhaps the most momentous year of the island's history, 1066. Among these powerful figures was Edward the Confessor, an Anglo-Saxon king who ascended to power due to the absence of an heir to the throne, succeeding the Viking king Hardrada. Upon Edward's passing on January 5th, 1066, the crown was contested by various claimants, and the one closest to the seat of authority, Harold Godwinson, took hold. A member of a prominent Anglo-Saxon family with ties to the Viking rulers of the North Sea Empire, Harold, who had been the Earl of Wessex during Edward's reign, and his brother-in-law, was proclaimed King of England. His ascension was backed by the Anglo-Saxon royal council, and he was crowned in Westminster Abbey on January 6, 1066. However, the succession was far from straightforward, as numerous challengers and potential usurpers emerged to contest Harold's tenuous hold on power. These claimants, akin to vultures drawn to the faintest scent of vulnerability, swiftly encircled Godwinson's domain upon hearing of his accession. Most notably among these contenders were the formidable Duke of Normandy, William, and the adventurous Norwegian king Harald Hardrada. Harald epitomized the Viking spirit. Said to be a giant figure of 7 feet, Harald was a daring, formidable, albeit somewhat reckless, Viking adventurer who carved his reputation fighting across Europe, often defying overwhelming odds. After more than a decade in exile, serving as a mercenary and accruing both wealth and military experience, Harald returned to Norway and was ultimately crowned king in 1046 AD. As fate would have it, Harald became embroiled in the dynastic dispute for the English throne through an unlikely character, Tostig Godwinson, the brother of the last Anglo-Saxon king, Harold Godwinson. Disillusioned with his brother for stripping him of his earldom of Northumbria due to accusations of tyrannical rule by the locals, Tostig sought potential allies outside England, driven by his grudge against his brother. Harold, a man unwilling to back away from such a prospect, promptly commenced gathering a substantial naval force during the spring of 1066 in preparation for a full-scale invasion of England. Meanwhile, Harold Godwinson faced the daunting prospect of a dual invasion. Reports indicated that William's substantial invasion fleet was already taking shape in Normandy, prompting Harold to assemble his troops to the southern coast of England, anticipating the Norman invasion. However, the anticipated Norman invasion failed to materialize, leaving Harold with a mobilized army facing the prospect of a prolonged and costly campaign that was depleting his limited resources without an enemy in sight. On September 8th, after months of waiting, with provisions running low, Harold disbanded his army and returned to London. Yet, the Anglo-Saxon king would have no time to rest. That very day, word arrived of a substantial Viking invasion fleet of 300 ships and approximately 10,000 men landing in England. Hardrada's sizable force had united with Tostig's smaller force and commenced raiding the eastern coast of England. They entered Cleveland, initiating raids along the coast. Their first encounter with resistance, occurred at Scarborough, with Harold's demand for surrender was met with opposition. Eventually resorting to burning down the town, Harold compelled other Northumbrian towns to surrender. Continuing their raids, Harold and Tostig navigated up the Humber, reaching Rickle on September 20th. Simultaneously, news of these raids reached two Anglo-Saxon rulers, Morka of Northumbria and Edwin of Mercia, prompting them to swiftly gather their forces and local feared to confront the invaders before reaching the city of York on September 20th. The two armies clashed in what would later be known as the Battle of Fulford. There were no elaborate tactics, only sheer force in a contest of shield walls, resulting in a resounding victory for the invaders, essentially decimating the northern Saxon armies and paving the way to York. Harold and Tostig proceeded to march on York, swiftly securing its submission. They then returned to their ships at Rickle and offered peace to the Northumbrians in exchange for support for Harold's claim to the throne, demanding hostages in return, leaving a portion of his force to guard his ships. Harold led the remainder of his army to the rendezvous point east of Stamford Bridge for the hostage exchange. Meanwhile, in southern England, Harold Godwinson remained anything but idle. Wasting no time, the Saxon king initiated an extraordinary forced march from London to Yorkshire, gathering his loyal bodyguards, known as housecarls, and recruiting as many thanes and local feared as possible along the way. Marching incessantly, Harold covered an astonishing distance of 298 kilometers within 4 days, an unprecedented pace for the era. This allowed him to catch the Norwegians completely off guard, as they were oblivious to the nearby presence of the enemy. On the morning of September 25th, 1066, the Saxon army had reached the city of York. Upon learning that the Northumbrians had been instructed to supply additional hostages and provisions to the Norwegians at Stamford Bridge, Harold hastened through York to catch them unprepared. Meanwhile, the mostly unarmored Vikings waited. Due to the warmth of the day, the sense of security, most of Hardrada's men had left their armor at the ships. The sight of distant dust likely puzzled the unaware Vikings, who began noticing the glint of armor and weapons. The growing force of armored warriors gradually forced Harold to realize his predicament. King Harold had arrived. Astonishment quickly turned into frenzy as Norse warriors harried to form their shield walls. The Battle of Stamford Bridge was about to begin. The Viking monarch swiftly commanded the raising of his personal banner, skillfully organizing his men in preparation for the imminent onslaught. Despite some of his officers advising caution and proposing a retreat to regroup with the remaining army at their ships, Harold staunchly refused to withdraw. Choosing to hold his ground, he dispatched a rider with urgent messages to this segment of the army stationed at Rickle, urging their swift march to his aid. His strategy aimed to detain the Anglo-Saxons long enough for reinforcements to unexpectedly arrive, launching an attack on the exposed flanks of the pinned enemy. Meanwhile, on the other side of the river, the Anglo-Saxon vanguard neared the bridge, defended by a hastily assembled shield wall of a few Viking warriors, caught on the western bank. Though their resistance was valiant, it proved futile as they succumbed to the overwhelming numbers of the Anglo-Saxons, falling to the last man. Now only the bridge stood between the two armies. According to the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, a lone colossal Norse warrior blocked the passage, wielding a great Dane axe. In a scene reminiscent of Levy's tales and echoing the heroic bridge defense of Horatio Cochley's, the Vikings single-handedly thwarted the efforts of the entire enemy army, cutting down foes like the Green Ripper. Up to 40 Saxons fell to the brave berserker until a cunning Anglo-Saxon soldier floated beneath the bridge on a half barrel, dispatching him by skillfully thrusting a spear into his unprotected groin. The path was clear for Harold Godwinson. Yet the valiant stand of the Viking giant bought ample time for the rest of the army to form a solid shield wall. Due to the significant numerical advantage of the Saxons, Harold ordered his troops to adopt an almost circular formation, guarding their flanks from all angles. The men aligned in multiple ranks, shields interlocked, standing shoulder to shoulder, creating a densely packed and uniformly thick shield wall. As Harold's army slowly trickled across the bridge, forming their battle lines, a mounted figure rode through the no man's land toward Hardrada and Tostig. This figure offered Tostig a return of his earldom if he would turn against Hardrada. Tostig inquired what his brother Harold would offer Hardrada in return. The rider's reply was 7 feet of English ground. As he is taller than other men, Tostig, unwilling to betray his ally, refused, thus rendering the battle inevitable. The mounted figure then rode back to the Saxon host. Hardrada, impressed by the rider's audacity, asked Tostig who he was. Tostig revealed that the rider was none other than Harold Godwinson himself. With both armies now formed, the Saxon line advanced against the Viking shield wall. Estimations for the numbers on both sides vary. It is generally accepted that the Anglo-Saxon army numbered around 10,000 warriors, while the Vikings did not exceed 6,000 men. Though some later sources claim the Saxons had cavalry, given the lack of evidence of its widespread use by the Saxons during this period, it is safer to assume that cavalry played no significant role in this battle. The two armies faced each other across the battlefield, exchanging taunts, battle cries and insults. Then came the order from the Saxon king: attack! The Saxon line surged forward, like a tidal wave of shields, swords and spears against the defensive Viking shield wall. The clash was fierce, but the Northmen bravely withstood it. Despite the momentum, the Saxons were unable to achieve a breakthrough. Shields shattered, swords splintered, and bones were broken during the initial push. Inspired by the chaos of battle, Hardrada, flushed with frenzied combat, began to sing verses, encouraging his men to persevere. In battle stormed with sick no lee, with skulking head and bending knee. Behind the hollow shield, with iron hand we fend the head, courage and skill stand in the stead of armor, helm and shield. In Hild's bloody field, rallied by their king, the Norsemen sensed weakness in the Anglo-Saxon ranks and started pushing them back across the line. However, their success brought about peril. When individual Viking units broke off their formation to pursue the enemy, the Saxons were able to attack their exposed flanks with various types of missiles and arrows, depleting their ranks and compelling them to retreat. Observing the critical situation unfolding, King Harold, who had been in reserve within the Viking formation, charged into the thickest fighting with his entourage. Yet, the impulsive actions of the Vikings were countered by the steadfastness of the Saxons. The Saxon king adeptly led his men, strategically probing the Viking shield wall for weaknesses while avoiding unnecessary risks. He judiciously held his personal bodyguard in reserve, intermittently launching volleys of arrows with his archers at the enemy. Saxon and Viking shield walls surged, colliding in a tempestuous clash. The air rang with war cries, the brutal symphony of clashing metal. Warriors, resolute and breathless, engaged fiercely. Iron clashed rhythmically, shields resisting unyielding assaults. The earth became a canvas, painted in sweat and blood, testament to the ferocious struggle for supremacy in the frenzied battleground. Amidst this chaos, Harald Hardrada, the Viking king, was struck by a stray arrow to his windpipe, mortally wounded. The man who'd later be remembered as the last of the Vikings met his end on the battlefield, a death worthy of Valhalla. As news of his demise spread through the ranks, the Viking battlefront began to disintegrate, losing morale in the will to fight. Sensing victory, the Saxon king launched a full-scale attack with his entire force, aiming to deliver the decisive blow and end the battle. Viking formations disintegrated into isolated pockets of groups of warriors overwhelmed by the victorious Saxons. At this juncture, the Viking reinforcements emerged on the battlefield. Nearly 3,000 fully armed men charged across the field, having force marched a distance of almost 25 kilometers. Reportedly, many collapsed and perished from exhaustion before engaging the enemy. The remaining men clashed with the incoming Saxons, checking their advance. Despite their valiant efforts, the depleted force was no match for Harold Godwinson's triumphant men, who were ultimately overwhelmed. Soon, the entire Viking army was in retreat, with some warriors fighting to the death, while others attempted to escape towards their ships. It was a magnificent triumph for Harold. The losses for the Saxon side remain unknown, but it is reasonable to assume that despite their victory, they suffered significant casualties. Conversely, the Vikings were utterly annihilated. So many perished in such a confined area that the field was said to still be whitened with bleached bones, even 50 years after the battle. King Harold accepted a truce with the surviving Norwegians, allowing them to depart upon providing pledges not to launch further attacks on England. The severity of the losses endured by the Norwegians was such that only 24 ships, in a fleet exceeding 300, were necessary to transport the remaining survivors away. However, Harold's triumph would prove fleeting. Merely 3 days after the battle, while still positioned in northern England, he received news of a Norman invasion force landing in Pevensey. Forced to swiftly redirect his troops, the Saxon king initiated a southward force march to intercept the Norman army. A few weeks later, he would face the second invasion of his kingdom at the decisive Battle of Hastings, which you can watch here.